because the enemy that we're fighting is constantly trying to change to win. All right. So the enemy that you're fighting is always going to make adjustments because they're not winning, they're losing. So they're not going to keep doing the same thing. They're going to change, which means by definition, you also must change.
I've never had a time in my professional life where Americans have been more concerned about their own self-protection. So a lot of people talk about training special operations groups, the secret agencies, and all of that. And that may or may not be true in some of their cases. But today I'm going to bring you a guy that is absolutely immersed in it. Does not talk about it, but is the real deal. He's not an Instagram, junkie. He's not a selfie guy. He's not a self-promoter. That way, he is a trainer par excellence. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about this guy. Tom Kier from SAYOC Tactical Group. I got to meet Tom a couple months ago in person, finally, at a conference that we were both speaking at. In fact, that's a picture of him at the conference. And I meet a lot of guys in the industry, but I just really connected with him on the way he looks at the subject of violence, how he trains, how his men train, and how he lives his life. So you probably are never going to get a chance to train personally with Tom, but this is your opportunity to learn from him, and I take full advantage of it. This is a 3-part series. He just goes in depth on so many just principled items. His background is amazing. He basically grew up, he was a tough kid from day one, learned to box, learned judo, learned how to grapple, wrestling. Very, very accomplished, tested his skill sets in the toughest bars in Philadelphia as a bouncer. And as he'd clean out each bar, he'd go to the next one because he didn't want to be someplace where he didn't get a chance to test his skills. And then he had a chance meeting. He didn't think much of martial arts at all. And a friend of his really wanted to go to this one martial arts demonstration. Tom accompanied him. He didn't really think much of what he saw so far, figured he'd test it out. He did, and he tore through the person that he tested out. But when he looked at his body, he realized that guy had a real knife in his hand instead of a marker, he would have bled out easily and lost. And he wasn't sure how he did it. So he tried it a couple other times, and guess what? Same result every time. He understood there was a skill set and there were things that he wasn't aware of, and he just decided to absolutely immerse himself. So you're going to hear how he took it from there. And now he is literally the go-to guy for most of the deep cover people in our military. And it's amazing the way they look at the subject and the way they continually improve their methods. So without further ado, Tom Kier. Okay. Tom, great to have you on the channel. Been meaning to get you on for quite some time. Ever since, I've known of you for years, and I have a couple of mutual friends that we know, and getting to meet you in LA was great because, like I was telling you earlier, it's rare when oftentimes the person you meet matches what you've been told, and you more than did that. Your presentation there was fantastic, and I really want to share your methods and your principles with everybody. But I think what's really important was you started out in LA talking about your background, and your background I think is absolutely critical for people to understand, because I'm sure later on we're going to make some statements that might be controversial in the industry, quote unquote. But it's well grounded. Your methods and your thoughts are well grounded, and because of where you came from. Could you just share with everybody kind of your background, what you came up from, and the fact that what I think is a common theme that I'm seeing with a lot of the people that I subject matter experts I bring on here, the fact that it could have gone either way, meaning you could have gone down the criminal path if you wanted to. It's usually there's this point where you got to make that decision. And, you know, what's interesting is somebody comes into your life at that time, or an event comes into your life that time that just ends up sending you down the road. So could you start there with everybody and just kind of let them know a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. My background, as you alluded to, you know, I had a very violent kind of upbringing. You know, I was in a household that was, you know, violence was an everyday thing, and it really didn't bother me. I kind of looked at it as that this is the way everyone lives, and this is the way life is, you know. So to me, there was nothing shocking about it, or nothing out of the ordinary. I was attracted to violent sports and combative sports, and you know, I played football and wrestled, mostly a lot of wrestling when I was young, and then boxing, and you know, I grew up when I was young outside of Philly, 30 miles or so outside of Philly, but then moved closer to Philly as I was a teenager, and boxing is a big thing there as well. So, you know, had access to wrestling and boxing as ways to as outlets, and later on, you know, I was also attracted to, you know, more violence when I was a teenager and early 20s, and I started working in bars as a bouncer. I was, you know, I was a 300-pound boxer wrestler, and I knew that I could make money, you know, kicking people out of bars and keeping the peace. But really, for me, it was an outlet for me to fight. And I worked in a number of bars that, you know, maybe were a little violent when I got there, but I put everyone on notice that if you're going to fight in this bar, you're going to fight me. And people stopped fighting in the bars that I was working in. And so then I would quit the bar, and I would move to another bar that was had a violent reputation, where I knew I could get in a lot of fights. So I did that when I was in my early 20s, and you know, was involved in other things that were, you know, I was like hired muscle for different people around Philly for collecting money, sending messages to people, et cetera, that kind of stuff, like crazy stuff that you do when you're young and you don't really know any better, you know. But I was definitely going down a bad path, you know, a path that could have been disastrous. And I was in hundreds and hundreds of fights and confrontations, and I enjoyed it. But in the back of my head, I knew that this is, you know, not sustainable. This is not something that you do. And a friend of mine who we had come up wrestling together, we were working at some of the bars together, and he wanted to get into more traditional martial arts. And at that time, I didn't look at martial arts very favorably. I looked at martial arts as kind of a joke, you know. In the hundreds of fights that I had, you know, anyone who was known as a martial artist couldn't fight. You know, there were guys who had never done anything and were street fighters that would crush those kind of classical martial art guys. You know, some guy who's a black belt in karate or something. Right. And everyone, you know, would state at some point, if they had a martial art background, they would let people know, you know, that they're a black belt or something like that. And of course, just destroying the reputation of those martial arts, because all of those guys get crushed. And, you know, they take some kind of stance, very rigid, and they just get steamrolled and stomped on the ground like somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And basically they don't. They didn't know what they were doing. Now, I consider wrestlers and boxers to be martial artists, but you know, they don't consider themselves to be martial artists necessarily. They don't necessarily look at it that way. So, you know, when I say martial artist, I mean everyone who would classically say that, you know. And so I didn't really care about getting, but he was my best friend. He's my training partner when it came to wrestling and boxing and stuff. So he's like, hey, I want to do martial arts. I'm like, all right, fine. You know, he liked to watch like Kung Fu theater on Saturdays and stuff like that. So I was like, okay, it's goofy, but I'll go with you and do this. And so we would go down to this martial arts school. It was a Kung Fu studio. And, you know, he had fun. And, but I started to meet some martial artists, and not all the martial artists that I met were inept kind of fighters. There were some of them that could handle themselves, and they just weren't the guys going out to bars at night fighting. So, you know, there was a whole group of martial artists that I met that, you know, they were capable individuals, you know. So we got into it, and eventually I met Chris SAYOC, who ended up being my teacher for 30 years after that, you know. So and this was SAYOC Kali, which is a Filipino martial art, dealt with blades and weapons. And you know, I had an interesting kind of introduction, meaning I still was very skeptical, and you know, I squared off with a guy who, you know, as a test, you know, we squared off. He had a black magic marker, and I told him I was going to take it off, and so we started moving around a little bit, and I am not. You know, I had no etiquette. You know, it was like I would bare knuckle punch anyone in the face and be like, "Hey, man, don't be a pussy. Like, you know, that bleeding will stop. You know, don't whine and cry to me about it. You know." So I was hard on him. You know, like I grabbed the guy and I choked him and threw him and punched him and took the marker off of him. And I say, "You want to try it again?" You know, and he said, "Well, look at your neck, look at your chest, look at," and I had marks all over me that I never felt during the altercation. And I realized that I'd be bleeding out right now, you know. And I thought, man, that's not good. So we went at it a couple more times, and I was rough on him every time, but I could not stop him from killing me with that magic marker. And I was like, wow, this is something I really need to you know, get a handle on. So that really was an eye-opening experience for me. And I got into Filipino arts, martial arts, and blade arts. And that was about 1990. And, you know, over the years, I had met some really good martial artists, but that was my introduction into really being serious about it. And, you know, I continued that study, but it was a good thing. And my instructor, Christopher Castaneda SAYOC Sr., who was the head of the SAYOC system, was also a mentor for me in getting me out of the thug life that I was getting into, and gave me a lot of ways to channel aggression, understand violence, and kind of come to grips with you know, navigating the world in a way that wasn't going to be completely destructive. And you know, I credit him with me away from a life that would have been, dead or in jail by the time I was 25, kind of life. So, yeah, so that was my kind of introduction. But, and I'd always loved weapons too. I was big into archery and shooting, competed even at that time in some competition shooting sports. But a real scientific understanding of weapons was something I did not have either. So yeah, so a lot came from my introduction and kind of mentorship given to me by Chris SAYOC. So
yeah, it's you said an interesting thing. I grew up on military bases, and so boxing and wrestling, that's the Marines taught us all the time. Mm-hmm. And it was weird when I got into martial arts originally, back when I, because it's real different today, but back then it was mostly the Korean arts were available. That was basically it. So I did Tung Sido, I had an instructor out there in San Diego. But what was weird was when I went in, you said that the etiquette thing, it was like you weren't allowed to do what you could do. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. And it was always strange to me. And then every time the actual guy that taught me actually was a good fighter. He was actually a good street fighter. But what was really weird was every time I would say, hey, I ran into this situation and I tried to, oh, no, you want to do this. And he'd show me something that was completely different from what we were training. And he said something to me that stuck with me the rest of my life. He goes, no. He goes, that's the art. He goes, that's the art. Here's how you fight. This is how you fight. Boom. And I said, well, why don't you show that all the time? He goes, oh, because that's just fighting. Like he literally delineated like the two. Yeah. He knew that, but in my mind, I was like, I got to know how to fight, And, so it was interesting. It was interesting having that effect. But back then, especially in those days, like you said, those guys were just getting torn apart. That was the one thing. Like nothing added up. I saw just a country boy who this black belt, quote unquote, at a school, just cut in line with him. This kid didn't even, he comb grabbed the back of his hair, kicked his feet out from under him, and just pounded his head on the lunch tray table and just dropped his ass, and that to me was just like, we thought the other guy was unbeatable, by his reputation. Yeah. And you quickly cut through all that stuff. No, that's juvenile and but it's very important because that embeds in your head. And what I thought was interesting was you gave a full pressure test on these guys, and you were able to pull your ego back to see, oh shit, yeah, it is a magic marker, but if that was a knife, this would have happened to me, and I have something that I can learn here. And I think that's probably the key, is when as a young guy, the first time you can check yourself and open up to maybe a different approach, I think that's huge. And then you took it. So you went and you found Chris and you immersed yourself in Kali and you changed kind of your path on how you're going. You quickly, you became one of the lead guys in there. Can you talk, what I think is so interesting about what you guys do, and probably for the uninitiated, we should talk a little bit about Kali, SAYOC Kali, and how it is. It's I don't want to jump ahead to where you're currently at and what you're doing, but what's interesting is the transition and how, again, it was recognized in other communities, military communities and stuff. The same kind of thing, same kind of value was recognized when they were introduced to people that had been trained in it. What was your process? So you guys started training, obviously, in Philadelphia. You're in the Philadelphia area, and then how did it all evolve from there? When did you guys start integrating people? I imagine, like most places, one or two operators probably trickle in as trainers, and then the word gets out, and then that's usually how it happens.
I was interested in military stuff and interested in getting into the military. I had some bumps along the way that would make it a little harder for me to get in.
Right.
You know, I was on the you know, I was a thug back then, and you know, it wasn't something that the discipline and the structure of the military was not something. I had a problem with authority, is what it was, and so, you know, very authoritative system, the military. So, but I respected warriors and I respected the guys who were doing the job. I had come to my teacher, Tuan Chris SAYOC, and I said, Tuan, I want to look at possibly building a program that we could train military guys, because everyone kind of picked their area that they were interested in, and there were guys that opened up, you know, schools to train kids because that's what they were interested in.
Right.
And you know, there are guys who did you know, women's self-defense or whatever, but I was interested in military stuff, and I know that he had trained the military before in the 70s, I believe, or maybe early 80s. But and I asked him, I went to him and said, Tuan, I'd like to, you know, look at developing something for the military. And he said, yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't you do that? I thought, okay.
Hey, Tom, just to clarify for everybody,
yeah.
Tuan is, can you explain the ranking system? Like, what is?
Yeah, so Tuan just is a master instructor. So the head of the system is called Pamana Tuhan, which is like the headmaster of the system. But after about 20 years of training, you can, so that's how long it takes to attain the rank. And the rank is based on a whole bunch of different things. You know, some of it is technical knowledge, some of it is application, some of it is deeds that are done within the tribe, within the system, and you know, accomplishments. And so I obtained the rank of Tuhan in I think 2007. So I had been in the system for about 17 years when I got the Tuhan rank. But you know, we refer to when we say Tuhan or Pamana Tuhan, we mean the head of the system, who he has since died, but at that time was Pamana Tuhan Christopher Castellano SAYOC Sr. Now, there are probably, I don't even know what the count is on number of Tuhans in the system now, but it's you know, it's somewhere around 10 probably. Mm-hmm. And these guys have all spent 20 plus years in the system and completely dedicated to it. And then we have full instructors who are, you know, 1 through 10 ranked full instructors. And then we have associate level instructors. And then below that, we have apprentice level. And then we have students. Then these are people who aren't looking to become instructors. They're just training in the system. And there aren't any various ranks of students. So student rank, but then if you want to be an instructor, you'll end up going through your apprenticeship. Then you'll go into an associate rank. Then you'll go into a full instructor rank, and then you would get your Tuhan rank. So that is somewhere around 20, 25 years typically to do that. So yeah, so that's the basic ranking structure of the system. And you know, we really didn't have a lot of that structure, because when I got into the system, it wasn't a public system. It was a private, family-based system that was handed down father to son over, you know, dozens of generations. So it can be traced back in the Philippines for, you know, probably over 500 years on paper, mostly documented from the Spanish, who had obviously been fighting a war in the Philippines to conquer it, and that fight had gone on for hundreds of years. But the SAYOC tribe or area of the mountainous regions of the Philippines was recognized by the Spanish as a problem, and the SAYOCs come from that area. So, you know, there's documentation and father to son kind of handing down of the system. So that's the structure of the system, and that's what I you know, got into in the early 90s. But so, you know, I was talking to Tuan SAYOC, and I said, you know, I wanted to do this, and he said, yeah, it's a great idea, go ahead. And then that was it. I said, well, what, you know, what's the next thing? He's like, I figured out, you know. So I was like, okay.
Classic answer.
Yeah. And so anyway, I had just kind of focused on curriculum that was applicable for that type of outlet of the art. And the art is very big. I mean, it's hundreds of years. So we have just so much information in the art, and some of it is not being taught anymore. But you can find the documentation on it. And I went back to the stuff that was used during World War II, during the Spanish-American War, and started studying some of that old material that was in the system. And it was like sensory removals and all kinds of stuff that, you know, if you have a martial arts school teaching kids, it's not the stuff that you teach them. But right. But it was all still there. And so I started studying a lot of that, and looking at some of the more aggressive applications of blade work. Once again, not something that the general population is going to be attracted to. So I started focusing on that a little bit in the system. And I was studying with Tom Brown because I was also interested in kind of bringing up all of the skill sets that I thought were important. So, you know, whether it is capability, medical capabilities, driving, shooting, pick and locks, man tracking, pretty much any kind of something that I thought was interesting and something that I was attracted to. So anyway, I was at Tom Brown's school for tracking, and
Tom's legendary.
Yeah. And so I was studying down there with Tom Brown quite a bit. And there's a lot of Navy SEALs that also go through Tom Brown's school. So when I was down there, I ended up meeting some of these Navy SEALs that were coming through and doing training with Tom. And that was my first time where I really was able to sit down and discuss combatives with an active military guy. And we had some great conversations and great training down there. So we would train every chance we got when we were down there. And he was really the individual who ended up getting us hooked up with the SEAL teams. And this was like 1997, maybe.
Right.
And 1998, something like that, maybe. And then I would make trips to visit those guys down in Virginia Beach. And I would just head down and we would train for 3 days or whatever. And then I would head back up to Philly. And I did this for a few years. You know, and then 9/11. And then that was everything changed, you know, everything changed as you remember. And the funny thing is there's guys that I'm training now that don't remember that were too young, crazy? You know, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
But after that, everyone went into, you know, and I had been training, I had, you know, 50 guys probably down in Virginia Beach who I had trained from, you know, 1997 to 2001, and then things started getting really pretty hot, you know, and so that was that was why we were so established with the SEAL teams, was because of that initial contact with them, and you know, a lot of those guys ended up progressing through the SEAL teams, and these are the guys who were really serious about combatives and very serious about fighting and training on their own, off in their off time.
Right.
And they're the same types of people who progress through any system or through any organization. They're the go-getters, the guys who are doing extra. And of course they progress to Dam Neck, and then we ended up being invited down there to do work with them. And the system, and this was from Tuhan. He said, if you develop this curriculum with the military, it needs to be organic. And I was like, yeah, organic, like it just grows however it's supposed to grow or something like that. He's like, no, it means there needs to be a feedback loop. Organic systems have feedback loops. So it's not static, it's not dead. It has a living element to it. And that living element is all of the different feedback loops feed back in to the direction that you go, the development of curriculum, feedback from the guys coming from downrange, coming back home from downrange, and immediately incorporating any of their questions and stuff that they learned downrange needs to be fed back in, and then it needs to be developed. So it needs to constantly be developed. He said that, don't fall in love with anything because everything has a shelf life, and it's not going to be traditional, because traditional means it doesn't change. Right. This is going to be organic. It's going to grow. It's going to shape. It's going to shift with the battlefield, which is ever changing. The thing that people need to understand is you cannot be static. Static is death, right? Life is movement. So change is life. So the thing is, because the enemy that we're fighting is constantly trying to change to win, right? So the enemy that you're fighting is always going to make adjustments because they're not winning, they're losing. Right. So they're not going to keep doing the same thing. They're going to change, which means by definition, you also must change, because your enemy's changing. If you stay the same and he changes to beat you, and you don't follow suit and keep evolving, he's going to answer all those questions that he couldn't answer, and you're going to start to lose. So the definition must be that we need to change. That's something that is a assured thing. So, we need that feedback loop. We need the ability to change. We need flexibility. We need, as the battle space changes. So, the rules of engagement, where we're fighting, how we're fighting, what we're doing, technology changes. So all of these things will feed back in to the curriculum. And so we're on the cutting edge of what needs to be done. And so that's how we developed it. And, the guys in the military develop their tactics the same way, now you want to do this proactively, right? So we want to do these changes before we need to do them. So we want to be one step ahead of the absolute necessity to make the change, because the necessity to make the change is when you find out you failed. Right. So people start to die, right? And then all of a sudden enough people die and people start to reluctantly change. And these are, reactive people. We want to be proactive,
What's the nuance in that, Tom? Like when you get the feedback loop with the operators, they're coming back from downrange, they give you stuff. How were you guys able to see something coming? Okay, we got to make some changes, like ahead of time, because I think that's just so key. And also just the reason I love to point this out to everybody is this is what dealing with the environment's all about. Real environment of dealing in violence and everything, and understanding what you're up against, understanding things change. Things aren't the way you wish them to be. They are a certain way. Yeah. And where would you guys where would you guys somebody'd come back, probably give you a little bit of information. You go, oh, okay, we got to be able to deal with that ahead of time.
Yeah. So, you know, sometimes they would get off the plane and literally show up, and they would have a list of questions like immediately. Sometimes it was, you know, sitting around, because a big part of our training cycle is, you know, we meet, we start the training blocks, we train throughout the day, and at night we're going to eat together. So we're going to have a meal together. And, you know, that is a natural cycle that has been part of the at least the male condition, you know, probably for the last 40,000 years. You know, you hunt together, you prepare for the hunt, sharpen your weapons, make your weapons, get everything you need together. You then hunt together. You start running and moving and killing. You process together, clean the animals, and afterwards you all sit down and you eat, right? So we look at that same cycle as just part of what it, of being a warrior or being a man, you know. So we train together, we sweat and bleed and repair afterwards, and medical management and stuff like that. But afterwards we have to sit down and share a meal, and a lot of times it's around the fire, it's around the meal table, where things start, you know, concerns start coming forward, things that happened overseas, kind of the in-depth philosophical talks about where the scope of the battle space is changing, what kind of things that we've heard or seen that are precursors to a big change that's happening, and things that need to be addressed, and then we you know, develop that plan of action, maybe sometimes right around the table, and then we'll start putting it into the curriculum and testing it and pressure testing it. So a lot of what we do is to look at technique and stuff like that, and then pressure test it in different environments with people who are, you know, looking to really pressurize it. So you know, mouthpieces get put in, and people are in certain situations, and we're constantly looking for ways to do that. But it is a process, and it's something that needs to be, you know, addressed consciously. You know, it will happen unconsciously to a certain degree, but not nearly to the level of thoroughness that we need to have. So we need to really consciously develop these feedback loops and listen to what they're telling us, you know. And so, you know, sometimes it was mistakes that were made, and other times it was just recognizing trends, that people can see patterns of how things are going. And a lot of times it's putting yourself in the enemy's position and say, well, if you were this enemy and this had happened to you 5 times,
right,
you know, what would you do differently? Like, and I've heard you talk about, you know, similar things, is that, you know, the guy you're fighting one-on-one with is doing this on his OODA loop. Like, he's doing this in a, he's trying to figure out how to win. And this can happen in milliseconds in an engagement. He may change his complete strategy. He may change his application of technique in some way that he thinks is going to serve him better. And you have to be able to see that. So on a time scale that's very compressed and very tight, we're doing the same thing, you know, and we're also doing it on a large scale that may be decades, you know, of change. So, but it's constantly happening. You know, these are dynamic situations, and it's just the nature of violence. You know, it's not static. It's not preset. You know, the first casualty of every battle is the battle plan. So if you go in thinking that you're going to know everything that's going to happen in any engagement, I mean, that's foolish, and it's a waste of your time, you know. better to be flexible and plan to be flexible and give yourself a lot of different tools to put into the toolbox. So if you need a different tool, you can reach into the box and get it. So that's part of flexibility. Part of flexibility is having the ability to fight on the ground, fight on your feet, grapple, strike, use weapons, produce weapons from everywhere. These are all formulas that you're developing so that you can be flexible, so that you don't have to have a plan that is, a 32-step plan that you follow from 1 to 32, because that's not going to happen. That's not going to be there. So, plan to be flexible.
It's also knowing, like, the one thing I really like about you guys is it's also knowing what tool to use in the environment. Meaning,
yes,
if you got the same freaking hammer for every nail, you're just done. And that's my big. What I love about this is that the operators trust you guys, and that they're coming in and they're sharing this, because that's a hard nut to crack.
It is.
Okay, I think that's a great place to stop it for now. Listen, just a lot of density in this. I was really excited to have Tom come on and share a lot of this. I hope you understand this is not normal for him. He doesn't necessarily do these long form interviews like this. And you're going to get an awful lot out of this. Just that last part, the fact that they're constantly refining, constantly getting that feedback loop, and actually changing methods to change with the environment, the threats, the technology, all of that. I will tell you, I've been doing this stuff for well over 30 years. I've trained under some amazing people. There are very few that live to what Tom just said. It takes a lot of control of the ego to let go of stuff that you may be really good at, but no longer is applicable. And that's what I think is so interesting about this group. So that's it for part 1. We've got 2 more parts coming up. Remember, timlarkin.com. Go get your masterclass. Just give us your email, free masterclass. We go in depth on a lot of the subjects that you have here. Also, please share this video with anybody that you think needs the best self-defense information. We are continuing to grow because of you. Make no doubt about it. YouTube keeps trying to stand in our way, but you guys are doing a great job at getting the word out. So please continue to do that. And the subscription really helps, as does you sharing the video. So until next time, stay safe.